Thank you all for joining Darien Library this evening for Shaker Architecture and Design with Cindy Dickinson of the Hancock Shaker Village. Cindy is the Director of Education at Hancock Shaker Village in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Hancock Shaker Village is a National Historic Landmark and living history museum that celebrates the lives and history of the Shakers, an American religious group founded on equality, perfectionism, and simplicity. It is set on 750 acres of farmland, meadows, and woodland in Western Massachusetts. The museum includes 20 historic buildings, a working farm, and a collection of more than 22,000 objects. And it's open from April through December each year. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that programs at Darien Library are made possible by the annual Friends of the Library campaign. We thank you for your support to make programs like this, as well as our collections available to the community. I hope everyone's ready to learn about Shaker architecture and design. I'm now going to pass the mic over to Cindy.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. It's a beautiful evening here in Pittsfield. So if it's beautiful where you are, I especially applaud you for coming inside to enjoy what I hope will be an enjoyable time together, talking about a wonderful topic. I am very pleased to be here. I was able to present a program last month, the Shakers Just Say No. And if any of you were joined us for that program, I promise that this one is different, but there'll be a little bit of repetition just to bring everyone else up to speed. I do hope that you will consider, now that the weather is getting even nicer, a visit up to Pittsfield and to Hancock Shaker Village. As Pat mentioned, we opened last month with a big program called Baby Animals, and we have a large farm. And the animals are still here, they're growing up, and we have lots of things to share with our collection and exhibits. So it's a good time to come and check us out. Let me share my screen, and we can get started with some wonderful images. Never a loss for good images with the Shakers. So tonight, with our topic, Shaker Architecture and Design, I hope to give you a sense of where the Shaker style that we might know about comes from. That it's a really richly connected to the Shakers' values and beliefs as a religious organization. I know that I myself am undergoing a kitchen renovation project in our home, and we just picked out the Shaker style cabinetry. And a lot of people have a Shaker style something, and they may not know exactly what that means. It's often the simplest profile or the most basic or functional design choice that you can make. So we're going to find out tonight kind of where that comes from. And at the end of my formal remarks, I'm very happy to answer questions. That's a great way to dive more deeply into this topic. You notice an image here on the screen of 3 chairs. And there is a saying among the Shakers that they did not want to be remembered as a chair, but that is often the first thing that many of us know about the Shakers. This simple slap back chair based on a style that was popular, not just among Shakers, but among many people who needed to sit in the late 18th century, has become something that's deeply associated with them. It's a very functional chair. It's everything that's part of it needs to be there to make it work as a chair. And that is kind of at the heart of the Shaker design. You'll notice one of the chairs is upside down, hanging on a peg rail. And the peg rail too is something that's very much associated with the Shaker design aesthetic, where something is practical. It may be up on the wall just to make it easier to clean what's beneath. And that's why this chair would be hanging up. So just everything is made in its best way possible to serve the function that it needs to. But there's a little bit more behind it. So that's what we're going to explore. I want to start by just making sure that everybody knows a little bit about the Shakers. The Shakers, as we've mentioned, are a religious group. They are a Christian Protestant group that began in England in the mid-18th century in the city of Manchester, very industrial city. At that time in England and elsewhere, there were many groups of people not too happy with the established religions in their respective countries. And so in England was no different. And there was a small group of people who felt that God could speak directly to them, and directly to them, not just through words, but through physical movement. And this group is the group that we now know as the Shakers. They were founded or eventually sort of led by the woman on the right, Anne Lee, and that in itself is something that set them apart. To have a female leader at this time was very unusual. And to see her ultimately as a manifestation of God's presence on earth was also very radical. So this was a group that was willing to believe things that others around them were not so keen on. At this time in England, they really didn't have time to have a design aesthetic. They were just trying to survive as a group. And as often happens with a religious group that's having struggles in its sort of origin area at this time, the Shakers got on a ship, just 8 or 9 of them, and came over across the Atlantic to what was then not quite the United States, and in 1774 landed in New York and made their way up to the Albany area and established themselves there, and eventually spread rather far into the New England area. This is a map that shows us the different locations of the communities. Ultimately, by the mid-19th century, there were 19 communities established, fairly successful, with at least 100 members, as far east as Maine and as far west as Indiana. The Maine community, the number 11 there on your map, is still active. There are still Shakers today. There aren't many of them, but those who are here are eager to carry on the legacy of the faith. They're very committed to that, and they do what they can to both share the history of their religion, but also the vibrancy of their beliefs as well. I am speaking to you from number 3, if you can find Massachusetts on the map. That's where Hancock Shaker Village is. The numbers indicate the order in which the communities were established. And you'll see that Connecticut also had a Shaker community, number 4, Enfield, Connecticut. Many of those buildings were ultimately purchased by the state of Connecticut and are now part of the Connecticut's prison system. So I hope that none of you have reason to visit it in the near future. But it is sort of near the Hartford Bradley International Airport. So the Shakers, at the time of their biggest sort of, when they were all quite active in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, had about 5,000 to 6,000 members overall. The membership was a little bit fluid, as we can discuss, but really stretched quite a while. And although their numbers were never huge, they have had a big impact, not only on design, but also on our culture as well. It's important to understand some of the principal beliefs that sort of distinguish the Shakers. I mentioned they are a Christian group, they are a Protestant group, but within those sort of parameters, they believe that God is both male and female. If God is able to create humans and we have characteristics of the masculine and feminine, then that must be reflective of God as well. Because God is male and female, then, and God is pretty awesome in their mind, then both men and women should be treated equally on earth, because you wouldn't treat one aspect of God less significantly than another. So the Shakers have been advocates might be a strong word, but practitioners of equality among the sexes in their own communities. Also, they believed in equality among all people, so that would extend to racial equality, equality for people who are differently abled, different ages, really seeing all humans as equal in the eyes of God. The Shakers did practice and do practice celibacy, and this is where people who are not Shakers often sort of stop and say, well, how did that work? How did they expect to grow as a community if they were celibate? But since there are still a few around today, it obviously has not caused them to completely cease to exist. But the celibacy is very important to them because it's kind of at the heart of their belief that they need to lead a sinless life. And it also reinforced equality between men and women because men and women were kept separate. That is one way that and we'll see that in their architecture, that the Shakers sort of expressed equality, but it was through separation. The Shakers do believe in confessing sin and doing that at times when it is needed. It is not a regularly scheduled activity. And they would talk to a trusted elder. The Shakers do have a hierarchy of leadership within their community. And while they have no appointed minister who is said to be the sort of bearer of the word of God, because that's really available to anyone who's a Shaker. They did have appointed spiritual leaders to whom someone could talk if they were having difficulty living celibately or liking their neighbor or adjusting to this new life that they were leading. So that was very important to continuing to lead the sinless life that they had committed themselves to. The Shakers believed in being humble, and that if you're humble, that's going to lead to a sense of order. And again, many of the Shaker beliefs are working towards living in an orderly community that reflects the perfection of heaven. They were pacifists. This comes from their Quaker roots. So their name Shaker is an elision of the words shaking Quaker. The Shakers were people who literally shook in worship with the physical expression of God's messages to them. And so, but like the Quakers, they did believe not in taking up arms against others. And that also naturally does lead to a more harmonious and unified world. So I mentioned that God can make a revelation to anyone, not just an official trained minister. And these revelations were referred to as gifts. You see on the right a beautiful, we would say work of art. The Shakers would just call it a gift, a message from someone who had died and gone before the Shakers on to the next realm and was sending back a message of encouragement. The Shakers were spiritualists, among other things, and did believe in communication with spirits of people who were dead. And so this is a lovely expression of that. There you can see writing on it, as well as these lovely images of the basket of apples. This is an example of a gift. You may have heard the motto, hands to work, hearts to God. This is a commitment to worshiping God all the time. So no matter what you're doing, whether you're actually sitting in a scheduled meeting, a Sunday worship service or an evening worship service, or you are cutting onions or planting seedlings or making an oval box or just doing the routine chores on a farm, that all of these things are acts of worship, and therefore all of these things need to be done to the best of your ability. Perfection in all things on earth mirrors the perfection of heaven. The Shakers were millennialists who believed that they were already living into the second coming, the greater world that awaited them. And so if heaven is perfect, if heaven is clean, if there's no dirt there, then you sure better not have dirt in your earthly home. This is a difficult way to live, all of these, especially the commitment to celibacy. And so the Shakers began to realize that living together in this way might make sense. Trying to live all of these values out just at home on a farmhouse in rural New England was very challenging. And so the Shakers established the communal societies, communal way of living, as a way to really help their members live out these beliefs. And these last three values, the all acts are acts of worship, that perfection in all things mirrors the perfection of heaven, and communal living, are to me the sort of core of what the Shaker architecture that we're going to look at and explore is based on, because they needed their architecture to help them live in the ways they had chosen to live. And so I think we'll see that coming up. So let me show you what our village, we're going to use Hancock as the example. Our village looked like in around 1830, 1835. This is a print from that time. And you can see, if you were the traveler here in the front, you would see something that might be a little unusual for that time, especially in a rural setting. You see a pretty big building right in the middle of the drawing. And you see a oddly shaped building off on the right with a little cupola on top. And you might really wonder, what is this place? And that's in a way what the Shakers wanted you to wonder, because as a group that did live communally and chose to separate themselves from the world, they didn't do a lot of missionary work. So they depended on adults to join them, because remember, they're celibate, so they're not producing their own new members. And they needed to be noticed. So you'll see that there is a road going right through this community. That is now Route 20, which is a state highway that goes from Pittsfield over to Albany. So that's a pretty big city. And you would wonder, if you were traveling along this road, like who are the people who could build these buildings? They're attractive buildings. They're well made. Who are these people? And it turns out that this community has some sense of organization. So the building on the left that looks to me a little bit like a barn, the gambrel roof kind of gives it away, is not a barn at all. It is, in fact, a worship space for this community, the meeting house. And I want to start by showing you the meeting house, because all of the communities, remember the map that we looked at, there was some need, even among the huge geographic distance that separated them, to try to keep these communities similar as best they could. So there was a central headquarters for the Shakers, and that happened to be located very near to where I am in New York, in a place called Mount Lebanon, or New Lebanon. And from this central ministry went out a lot of rules and suggestions of how all the Shakers should live, so that the Shakers were the same. They were all working towards the same goals. And one of the ways for that sameness to be realized was to have the same meeting house. So the meeting house that you see here is the last remaining original meeting house for any of the Shaker communities. This was actually built for a community east of here in Shirley, Massachusetts, but it is identical to the one that was at Hancock. And you'll see that it is a very simple building. It has nothing gives it away as being a worship place for a Christian group. It's got two doors on the front, and this is very important. You'll see this again in another building. One door is for the women, or the sisters, as the Shakers call them, and the other door is for the brothers. So this is an example of the separation I was explaining, the equality yet separate. So separate entrances, and they would come in, and the sisters would remain on the side of the building that was set aside for them, the brothers on the other side. But there is no distinction between these two doors. The doors are equally wide. They both have windows on either side. There's no way to look at them and say one is a masculine door and one is a feminine door. These buildings were designed by a Shaker named Moses Johnson in the 1780s, in part because, and they're this style because they allowed for an open floor inside. And because the Shakers danced in worship and moved about, they needed an open floor that was unobstructed so that they could move in these large groups with the spirit as it manifested itself. So just one example of something that, again, the design is driven by the needs that they have, both for how they worshiped, but also for what they believed. It also, though, is very similar to architecture of the time period out in the world. So you see that they are sort of adapting what they know from their experience in the world to their needs as a Shaker community living withdrawn from that world. I want to turn to this building. This is a fascinating building, and this is the building that we saw in the middle of that print. Let me go back to that for just a second. That tall building there, right in the center with the windows. This is the building that is known as the dwelling. And I want to say that this was built in 1830. So Hancock was formed in 1790. It was the third of the Shaker communities to be established. And that's a significant, those two dates are significant because they tell us that 40 years passed between the establishment of the community and the building of this really pretty significant structure. This structure was intended to house all of the Shakers who lived in this part of Hancock, and that was about 100 people. Prior to building this dwelling, the Shakers lived in a couple of buildings that they had built. There were also some farmhouses around that were part of the land when they acquired it initially as a community. And so by the time they built this building, they really knew what they wanted their architecture to do for them as a community. So there are a couple of things to note. As you saw from the illustration, this building is built right on the road. So there is no way that you can miss this building if you're passing along on this post road. So for one thing, it's advertising. It's pointing out that, wow, this is a place that can build a big brick building at a time when very few people would have necessarily had houses made out of brick, but certainly not a 3-story building with lots of windows and shutters and all, and a huge roof. So that tells us something about this group. My goodness, how could they do this? It's also simple, but it's elegantly made. The bond, the way the bricks are laid, is in one of the more elegant styles of bond laying. And the little extra stone touches above the windows, and that's, did they really need to do that? Maybe not. It makes it a substantial building. It also gives it just a little bit of hint of decoration. We think sometimes the Shakers did no decorating, but that's really not the case. They were subtle in their decoration. There's a bell tower on top. That's important for the function of the building. We're going to come to the south side of the building and notice that, again, you see a very substantial building, not unlike some of the buildings being built in the world. This is a typical kind of federal style building in many ways, but again, just a very large version of that. The closest building place that someone might have seen a building like this in our area would likely have been up at Williams College in Williamstown. So looking at this building, again, there's nothing that really tells us much about what's happening inside. We have this single door, and I will tell you that it leads to a very interesting part of the building, and that is the kitchen. But the building is structured so that the kitchen is on the lowest level, as is the food storage. So the food storage is part of a cellar, a sophisticated cellar that allows for food to be stored throughout the year. The Shakers therefore ate very well all year long: vegetables, fruits, different sorts of drinks, beverages, lots of things they would put up for the winter. And all that is part of the cellar floor. The next floor up is what I think of if this were a dormitory, a similar dormitory, with the dining room, a large dining room, and then a large meeting room for gatherings on days that were not Sundays, so their evening worship. The next two floors are bedrooms, retiring rooms, as the Shakers call them. They are retiring from the day. And there are 20 of those bedrooms. So this is for 100 people. So as you're doing the math there and you're at home, you realize that the Shakers didn't have a lot of privacy. If you became a Shaker, you were sort of in some ways giving up our American ideal of the individual is best. The Shakers are really living in a way that's very non-traditional for the American dream. So you don't have a lot of privacy, but you do have a pretty nice place to live. The upper two floors in the attic are all beautiful built-in storage. So you can tell that the Shakers, 40 years into living together as a communal society, finally built the building that they had all been wanting to live in for a long time. And let's go inside and take a look. So here we have one of the retiring room floors, and you'll see that there's really no difference down the hallway. It's a very much a mirrored, or again, a kind of a federal style, very symmetrical building. But this devotion to symmetry has an additional meaning, and that is it expresses the commitment to equality between men and women, because women lived on one side of this building and men lived on the other. And yet there is no architectural distinction between the two sides. So in this case, we are looking south. The sisters or the women's side is on your right. The men's side is on your left. And again, the same bedrooms. You see an example of a brother's bedroom on the left photo, but the same type of bed, the same chairs. The clothing was different. This is men's clothing that you see, are all available to all the members of the society. And speaking of clothing, the Shakers were well clothed. They had lots of clothes. There's an inventory of one particular Shaker sister, and it just goes on and on and on with dresses and undergarments and shoes and so forth. So although the Shakers lived what we think of as a simple life, a life committed to God and to making the world a better place, they were not punishing themselves by doing so. They were simply doing what they needed to do to live, but they weren't just trying to suffer. It wasn't a punitive community. If we go downstairs in the building, this is the dining room, and this is my sort of favorite example of how to show this commitment to equality through architecture. We have two doors that open into the dining room, and you can probably guess by now what those are for. In this case, we've switched our perspectives. So the door on the right is the brethren's door into and out of the dining room, and the door on the left is the sister's door. It's a really wide hallway, so that as the men and women were coming down to the dining room or leaving the dining room, they wouldn't be able to touch each other accidentally as they pass down the hall. There is no divider in this building to separate the men and women. It is simply understood that each will keep to his or her own side of the building. Notice there are the same tables on either side of the dining room. Both sides have a stove to keep them warm. So just a lot of clever commitment to that sort of expression of equality. You also see some very practical considerations. It's as a big building built before electricity, they were going to have a lot of potentially dark hallways, but they're making use of transom windows. You see one over the doors, very large door, to let a lot of the light that was coming in from the outside on this corner room into the hallway. So even though we do now have some electricity in the building, it's impressive that even without that, we can still usually make our way through the building without turning any lights on. And this is another view of the dining room. Again, you see some of the things that we think of when we think of Shaker style, the very simple chairs, the simple trestle tables, and just beautiful cabinetry doors, built-ins. This building is filled with built-ins. I believe I have a picture of that. Yes, so many built-ins in this building, and that is amazing to me. If the whole structure was built in just 1 year, and you saw the outside, well, the interior is just as impressive. And notice these floor to ceiling built-in cabinets and drawers. Almost every room in this building has these, and there is a practical reason for there being floor to ceiling. There's no reason that you need to dust the top of a piece of furniture or dust underneath. Again, there was no dirt in heaven. Why should you waste your time cleaning off dirt if you could simply build things that didn't have to collect dirt? So always thinking ahead and making their work. They wanted to do work and they wanted to do good work, but they didn't want to do unnecessary work. Just on the right here, this is a peek inside the cabinets. We're talking about decoration and Shakers. And the Shakers did actually paint more of their surfaces than sometimes it appears. Later, collectors have often stripped the furniture, not just of Shaker work, but other furniture, just to get back to that natural wood-like look that we have come to like in our more modern times. But the Shakers actually had quite a color palette that they used in their buildings. And you can see some of the chrome yellow on the interior of this cabinet door on the right. Just a couple other things to show you again, the design of the Shaker stove that you see on the left also has a very practical, functional purpose. It is small. It was used to burn wood, but it's every surface can radiate heat. And these stoves were in every room. So in a sense, the building was centrally heated, even if you did have to build a fire in each stove. And they had these long pipes that if the stove were set in the middle of the room, which it often was, the heat also radiated off of the stove pipe. So the rooms were warmer than a typical sort of fireplace set into the wall. And again, they were comfortable, but there was an awful lot of time spent on chopping wood. And in fact, there was a whole huge building devoted to the storage of that firewood. On the right, one of my favorite things in the dwelling, this is a cupboard that goes from the kitchen, which is on the bottom level, as we saw when we looked at the outside, to the first floor where the dining room is. So you might think that building a dining room above a kitchen is very impractical for these practical people, but it made sense sort of for the overall design of the building. And they knew they didn't want to carry food upstairs for 100 people. So they built in these movable cupboards. These are, we might call them dumb waiters or movable elevators, but the entire cabinet, all those shelves move, and you can see the heavy rope that was used to pull them up. They eventually did mechanize these, but there was one on the sister's side, which is the one you're looking at, and one on the brother's side, so that the food could be brought up to each side, and no one had to cross the invisible line to get to their food. So that is the dwelling, and I could go on, but I do hope you'll come see it in person because it is an amazing structure. The Shakers were, as communal groups, almost all of them, with one exception, which I can describe in after I'm done talking, if you'd like, in Philadelphia, were all located in rural areas. And so they were all agricultural communities. They all had to grow their own food. They had their own animals. They really took care of themselves. And yes, this was at a time when you would have, even as a lone farmer in a farmhouse, grown your own food, but they really kind of did it up right. So with lots of people available, lots of labor available, they were able to produce really wonderful gardens and to take care of a multitude of animals. Hancock, that round barn that we saw in our print earlier, and it's reproduced again here, was the only round barn known among the Shaker community. So whereas they had a similar architecture for their meeting houses, many of the other buildings, while they'd have the same type of building, didn't necessarily have to look the same. And that was the case for barns. So for whatever reason, sadly unknown to us, the Shakers that record didn't survive, chose to build a round barn here at Hancock Shaker Village. And it was a twofold purpose. One, it made it easier to bring in a lot of hay to feed the cows that they were known for, their dairy cows. And also it was a very large milking parlor. The round barn essentially functioned in the center as a two-story hay mow, where the hay was stored to feed all these animals. And then the cows could ring around the outside on the bottom floor, not the outside of the building, but the outer part of the floor, first floor, and be milked. And it allowed 52 cows to be milked at a time. So the function of the barn, no one living alone with their family would need a barn this big. But for 100 people needing to be fed, this was a perfect size for the size herd that they had, and also the amount of hay they needed to store. The building did undergo some changes over time. And you see on the left in the 1826 is when the building was built. It had a conical shaped roof. By the late 19th century, the building had been restructured. There was a fire that caused, we're not really sure why, but it did give them a chance to make some improvements. And so they added this sort of tiered roofing system that gave them a lot more opportunity for more windows, for more light on the interior. It allowed for more ventilation so that a fire wouldn't happen again from spontaneous combustion from all of the hay. And so this, that's another thing about the Shakers that contributes to their design and architecture, is a sense of looking again at what they have and improving it if they can. One of the things, the Shakers are sometimes compared by our visitors and others to the Amish, and there's not a lot in common between the Shakers and the Amish. And one key difference is that the Shakers really embrace technology. You see that even in the dwelling with the construction of the built-in cupboards, or the cupboards to move the food from the kitchen to the dining room. They're really eager to take advantage of whatever might make work better and more efficient, and even if it does involve a machine. So improving the barn efficiency was also important to them. And you'll see that here, and you'll also see it again in another building, just a minute. This is what the roundstone barn looks like today. And again, you see it's very similar to its late 19th century appearance, but it was just one of a number of barns on the property that Shakers needed places to keep all kinds of animals. And in fact, we have perhaps the nicest chicken house you will ever see. That is this structure. This is not a home for people. This is a chicken house. And it again speaks to the Shakers' commitment to kind of understanding farming practices, and also trying to make their own the best that they can be to produce the most eggs, have the healthiest chickens, and so forth. This is a little bit later building. This is from 1878, and it does kind of echo the brick dwelling, which is just behind it. It's made of brick, so it would stay warmer longer in the winter time, and also probably cooler as it moved into summer. It has a lot of windows here on the south side to allow light in, and it faces the south, so that the chickens would lay more eggs throughout the year for a longer period of time, and again stay warmer. The north side has only 4 windows, so the Shakers understood, solar. We would sort of the power of the sun and solar efficiency. So this is a passive solar. Great example of passive solar. You see an apple tree on the right. There was a second one kind of right in the middle of our view that would shade the building in the summertime, so it didn't get too hot. So just a lot of little things about just this one building that were so thoughtful and went into making the egg production, which was important to their community, both to eat the eggs and the chickens, but also to sell to the wider world. So that architecture being practical, efficient, and also very, very attractive. Just wanted to give you another view of the community. This is looking at the brick dwelling from the opposite side that we saw in the first illustration. This is a view done in the mid-19th century, so a little later than the one we looked at. You see the dwelling, and then you also see a lot of work buildings. So the Shakers did work a lot in different activities. We've talked about farming. There was a lot of work going on in the dwelling with cooking and cleaning, but there were also things like making furniture, making hooks, or things out of metal from a blacksmith shop. There were baskets that needed to be made, brooms, and that's the type of work that was going on in the buildings that you see in front of you. You'll also notice a carriage. This is in the foreground of this image. These are world's people visiting the Shakers, and we're going to talk in just a minute for our final building about what that interaction was like. Just wanted to show you up close one of the work buildings at our village. This is the Sisters Dairy and Weave Shop. It's located fairly close to the Roundstone Barn. This is where the Shaker sisters would make butter and cheese out of the milk products from the cow. And you can see in the background the north side of that poultry house that we were looking at. So these buildings are all relatively close together. Architecturally, this is a very straightforward building. You wouldn't really know what it was intended to do from the outside. It looks very much like a house, and may even have been a farmhouse prior to this land becoming the Shaker community. This is an 18th century building, but the very sort of not lacking adornment, but it is, look at the color. There is that lovely sort of bright yellow color that you'll see a lot in the Shaker palette. All right, our last building that I want to show you is a building called the office, or the trustees office. And one of the components of all of the Shaker communities was this need to communicate with what they called the world, with a capital W, the world they had left behind by joining the Shakers. They couldn't completely separate themselves from that world, and so they needed kind of an intermediary between themselves and the world. And that was really what the office's function was. The people, the Shakers who worked in the office, were in charge of the business dealings and just sort of the general hospitality for the world's people. They needed the world's people to want to be Shakers. Remember, they had to rely on adult converts. So they needed a welcoming place. They needed people to welcome the outside world. They needed to sometimes be a tourist attraction and be a place where fine products were sold. And as the Shaker name and reputation grew for high quality everything, the desire among the world's people for Shaker made things grew as well. And those were often sold through the office. So if you can see, the initial office was a sort of generic drawing here on this map from the 1820s. But on the right, you'll see a building that looks very much like that Sisters Dairy that we just saw, a bigger version of it, a typical frame clapboard sided building, very straightforward. And as time went on, the Shakers began to realize that maybe the world's people weren't attracted to that structure, that maybe they needed to change its appearance a little bit to suit modern times. And so they embarked on what I see as kind of a big marketing campaign through architecture. And they changed the entire facade of that building to look very what we'd call Victorian. there suddenly is a turret. There are bay windows. There are lots of shutters. There's a lot of decorative molding around the roof line. You got a lot happening here. Porches. This is not your typical Shaker building, and yet it is, because all of these decorative elements are serving a very important function, and that is saying to the world, we are not as unlike you as you may think. Come in and check us out. So in architecture, they were expressing this, they were communicating more about themselves, just like with the brick dwelling and its impressive appearance in the 1830s. Here in the 1890s, you have a similar call to the public to say, look at who we are. Don't you want to know more? This is an interior view of the Trustees. You'll see a mix of Shaker, what we think of as Shaker furniture, a little chair in the back, or rocking chair, but also upholstered furniture. So if you came into the Trustees, you again might see carpeting. That again, these people are not as unlike me as I thought. So I did want to just address those are our sort of buildings visit of Shaker architecture. I did want to go back for a moment to the idea of the Shakers as a chair, and to say that even among the Shaker, typical Shaker slapback chair design, there's actually a fair amount of variety. And that would be kind of emblematic of the Shakers themselves. The Shakers wanted to be thought of as a single unit, a community, a union, the group before self. But really, they're all people, just like those of us out in the world, and they all have little individual expressions too. So even within the chairs, there are different types of chairs. The chair on the left is a dining chair. You may have noticed it in the picture of the dining room. The backs are very short so that they could easily slide underneath the dining table. And that made it easier to wipe the table down and to clean it. So again, a very practical reason to have a short back chair. A rocking chair in the middle, the Shakers, again, were not punitive, I mentioned. And so rocking in a chair was okay. I always thought that seemed like, why would they have rocking chairs? But they knew that people didn't want to just sit up straight all the time. And you'll notice different types of seat backs. This particular type of chair was probably more likely made to sell. The Shakers did sell chairs. The chair factory was at that central ministry Shaker community in Mount Lebanon, New Lebanon. And even at Hancock, we would have had some chairs made at Mount Lebanon. The chair on the right is one more typically thought of as the Shaker style chair. But this one too has a fun feature. On the back two legs are what are called tilters. And if you had sat in this very straight chair, which I can vouch for being uncomfortable, you might have wanted to tip it back. And the Shakers sort of, again, sort of holding the practical side with the desirable side, said, it's not really safe for people to tip over in their chairs. So they developed a little invention to let the chair tip back, but it still kept the back of the leg flat on the floor. So it's a little ball joint that allows the chair to tip, but the little foot stays flat on the floor, so the chair doesn't have the tendency to fall over with its sitter. Very, very clever people. Oval boxes are another thing we associate with the Shakers. Again, they're simple, but yet they're efficient to make. They are flat, start out as flat pieces of wood that are soaked and then bent and tacked together, and they can hold all kinds of things and come in all different sizes. So this is another thing that we think of when we think of kind of Shaker design. It's simple but beautifully made, and even the joints, the swallowtail joints, have a purpose of kind of spreading themselves out, so there's less of a tendency to crack. They're on the flat side of an oval instead of round, so that they're just going to hold that box together more straightforwardly. And I wanted to show you just another thing that reminds us the Shakers did have color, and they did there was some vibrancy to their living. that the women, the Shaker women, would have been all about the textile making. So although the Shakers believed in equality between men and women, they did divide the work along typical gender lines. So women typically did the cooking, the cleaning, the textile work, the dairying. The men would do the heavy agricultural work, the blacksmithing, woodworking, and so forth. So here you see it, Shaker's sister Alice Smith at a loom, but the loom would have been made by the Shaker brethren. The women would have carded the wool, spun the wool, woven it, knitted it, and so forth. But just an example of a woven Shaker textile, they did make all of their own clothing and fabric up until the time when it became more efficient and effective and financially cost effective to buy it from the outside world. Just a beautiful design, very simple, plain weave, but just enough of a design to show some sense of design interest. And then my favorite thing, the blue silk shoe. These were worn by women in worship. And so they had special shoes just for worship and dancing. And the blue color was only worn in worship. So little things that we might not think about with the Shakers and design and their architecture can come together in interesting ways. But because the Shakers were such a holistic group, everything that they did mattered to everything else that they were doing, even as much as a blue shoe to wear to the meeting house for their Sunday worship to be express themselves as Shakers. So I leave you with that image and with a very, I hope, enticing view of our village with our poultry house and our brick dwelling and other buildings taken from the top of the roundstone barn, to hope that you'll come and explore this world of architecture and design and belief all in one city of peace, as the Shakers called their community at Hancock. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take some questions if you have them.
Cindy, thank you so much. That was fascinating. Did the Shakers ever engage with the world people to teach architecture or furniture making?
That's a good question. One of the reasons that the Shakers divided their work along kind of traditional gender lines is that because most Shakers came in as adults, they would be coming in with skills that they had learned out in the world. And so likewise, although they kind of separated themselves, they still had ties to the world. And there's certainly lots of examples of people coming to visit the Shakers, both because they were curious about their religion, but also very interested in their architecture. Yes, the barn at the Hancock certainly was an attraction, the dwelling. There are lots of writers who would write about it, especially in the 19th century, kind of marveling at the technology that was available in the buildings, the size of the buildings as well. So people like Charles Dickens visited from England and tried, wanted to visit the Shakers too. So there was a lot of curiosity. Yes.
Okay. And also, you mentioned that there's a community in existence now in Maine at Sabbath Day Lake.
Yes.
Are they still a rural community?
Yes, they are located north of Portland, they have a affiliation or connection with Poland Springs, the water sort of resort at the time and now a company. So they're very close to that location, and they still have many of their historic buildings are ones that you can visit. They were closed during COVID. I think they're planning to open them back up if they haven't already. They have an active farm, and then they have a very active friends in their community, their wider community, that help them with just kind of staying active and staying committed to their beliefs. They've got a couple of stores that you can purchase things at. And they also have a pretty active web presence. Their website is up to date. They do participate in Facebook, and they've been doing virtual programming too.
Oh, very interesting. I don't know. I think that we don't have any other questions.
All right.
This was terrific. Thank you so much, Cindy.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, there is one question. Visited Anley Shaker Village in Colony, New York, many times due to her mother's Dutch Huguenot family. Sister Anley and Sister Cemetery are buried in Watervliet. Beautiful ground, simple, tranquil, near Albany International Airport.
Yes, the very first Shaker Village, this person is, yes, it's called Shaker Heritage Society now. That's the group that runs it. And when Mother Ann Lee first came to the America and moved up to the Albany area, they settled in what is now very close to the Albany airport. And they do have the cemetery where Mother Ann is buried, along with a number of other Shaker leaders. And their community was, the buildings, many of them were purchased by the county of Albany. So they are kind of like the Enfield community. Their buildings fell into some disrepair. Some of them are now open to the public. One of the things about Hancock, it had Shakers living at it until the 1950s, and most of the other communities had closed by that point, and they saw the Shakers living here realized that if they didn't do something to protect the sort of their legacy, that they might also be sold out of the Shaker use. So we're very fortunate that they chose to sell the property to a group that opened this village as a museum. And some of the sites have had to retroactively kind of renew their Shaker identities. And so we're fortunate that that didn't happen here. But the Shaker Heritage Society is certainly a wonderful place to visit, and seeing Mother Ann's grave is really exciting.
I bet. And Christine's asking about medical concerns. I'm not certain if she's asking regarding what their belief in medical care was.
That in itself, Christine, is a very fascinating topic, and I promise not to go on too long about that. But as a communal group, taking care of their health was very important. And as we have seen with COVID, living in a large group like this, they were quite concerned about contagious diseases, even when they didn't necessarily understand how disease was transferred. So they were very careful about health. They, as I mentioned, they ate well, not just because they had all this bounty, but they sort of recognized that a good diet contributed to healthy workers and people were able to stay fit. They had their own medicinal herb gardens. They were aware of the healing properties of plants. They would send, in rare connection with the world, they would send occasionally a member of the community out to be medically trained in the world and return to be the doctor in the community. So they really had pretty advanced healthcare for the time, and developed all kinds of interesting little inventions to make life easier. Older people, they had an adult cradle that the adult could be rocked in if they needed that kind of healthcare. Very nice 4-corner walking sticks for people who needed that support. Beds that would tilt up so your legs could be elevated at a time when that was kind of unusual. So they thought a lot about health, and had a fairly sophisticated health system, and sold medicines to the outside world. Their own medicines were so successful that they were at one point the leading supplier of medicinal herbal products to what we'd call the pharmaceutical community. It was a big moneymaker for them as well.
Fascinating. Cindy, thank you again for a wonderful hour.
Oh, thank you. I enjoyed it. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming.